Thank you all for joining this ICG webinar. I know it's a bit late for some of you and a bit early for some others, but I'm absolutely delighted to have with us today Stephen Hewett, who's an exceptional entrepreneur, a consultant, and more interestingly, he has written three wonderful books. The Customer-Centric You, People Centricity, and The Customer is the Agenda. I would like to extend a very warm welcome to you, Stephen, as our newest global thought leader. And on behalf of ICG, thank you, Stephen, for joining us on this webinar about the global thought leaders.
It's a pleasure, thank you. And thanks to everybody who, as you say, it's either good morning, late night, or good day, I guess.
Thank you, Stephen. For the benefit of the others, we schedule these webinars for those who have not or who are joining us for the first time as a way for our consultants around the globe to get to know our global thought leaders and feel more confident in the way they can approach them and to work with them and to help commercialize the IP that we bring to the ICG platform through the global thought leaders. We believe that the thinking of our global thought leaders will be deeply impactful to your clients. And we run these webinars, these global thought leader webinars, with three objectives. The first thing is to, a lot of thought goes into the research that the global thought leaders do. So we want to bring unique perspectives on some of the hot topics, and these are being delivered by very highly regarded thought leaders. Hopefully, some of this will provide a good narrative and a competitive narrative for you to take to your clients. The second objective is we want to understand the mechanics, want you to understand the mechanics of how the IP from the GTL will be productized and made available to you through our platform, through the ICG platform. And then hopefully at the end of the webinar and soon thereafter, arrive at some sort of call to action situation where you at the either arrange a one-to-one meeting with the thought leader or get some kind of a link to download some white papers perhaps, or learn how to get accredited in the tools and frameworks that they bring to the ICG platform. And also perhaps seek assistance in developing a playbook for your specific client situation. So with those objectives in mind, we have put together a webinar agenda, and most of you have seen it. So I'll let you sort of go through this, so I won't have to read it line by line. And the way this webinar will be orchestrated is in the following way. I will lead the discussion with Stephen through a series of questions. And at the end of it, there'll be enough time left for questions that you might have for Stephen. And you can post those questions in a written form. And if you see at your webinar dashboard, you'll see a tab which says questions. So you can ask them that way, or you can ask Stephen the question orally when the Q&A session is opened. And during the period of this webinar itself, when I'm conducting the interview, I will have muted everyone else except David and Stephen. Now back to you, Stephen. It would be great if you can take a moment and introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about you personally.
Hi, Gopal. Yes, I'd be very happy to do that. And again, thank you to everybody who's taken the time to listen. There have really been three stages to my career, and I'll go through those, which are highlighted on the slide in front of you. You'll see some points about the kind of stuff that I do. But let me just talk a bit about my background. I started my career in general aviation. I was lucky enough to be recruited directly from school into a commercial pilot training scheme. And I spent about 10 years working in that industry. Actually, I have to say, although I qualified, I spent most of my time in the business and the operations side of the business. I think the reason that's relevant to what we're talking about today is it gave me a very tentative age access and exposure to a whole variety of different customers from different walks of life, from people who were obviously extremely wealthy through to people who were just passionate about the aviation industry. So it started to stir an interest in me about understanding what motivates customers, what they're interested in, and what retains them. And then maybe it was a natural move from there that once I got married and had a child, I thought I'd better get a proper job. And I was lucky enough again to be offered something called a senior learning scheme at John Lewis department stores in the UK. So some of you will know them. They're the largest, one of the largest department store groups in the UK, and have an excellent reputation for customer service and customer engagement. And one of the unique things about them is that they're owned by the employees, so they're partner owned. The training scheme I joined allowed me to move from shop floor to shop floor management, and then I spent 3 years working in IT and IS, and then eventually in the latter part of the 1990s I ended up working in research and development at the centre, and that was very exciting because we set up John Lewis's first ever customer database. We did that with a chap called Clive Humby, who some of you may have heard of from dunnhumby, the people who are now an international organisation, but it set up Tesco's club card system in the UK, a loyalty system. And in the sort of early noughties, I also was in charge of and launched John Lewis's first set of e-commerce sites, which have gone on to be extraordinarily successful for the business. And in fact, I was the guy who bought johnlewis.com from Professor John Lewis in the United States, who sold it to us for a mere $10,000. I don't think he really knew what he had. And then from there, really, I was enticed into the world of management consulting. I joined a firm in the City of London called Charteris Management Consulting. About 10 years with them, and became eventually head of consulting. And it was while I was there that I began developing this proposition set, which focused on customer centricity for clients. And I'll go through later a few examples of how that's been applied. Most recently, I have my own boutique consultancy here in the UK called iCustomer. And of course, I'm now also working very closely with the London hub on developing ICG's propositions within the UK and Europe.
Great. Thanks, Stephen. That's fantastic. Since it's a thought leadership program that we're running, one of the things is that true thought leadership is about adding information. That's about sharing what you've done as a change agent, your lessons learned and the mistakes you've made along the way, and so on. Because those are the kind of stories that resonate well with people. So we want to hear not just about your expertise, but how you came about your hard-won knowledge. That's what I think will really enrich the conversation. And as you know, Stephen, thought leadership is not just being about being known, it's about being known for making a difference. So my question to you is, how have you made a difference, and how would you summarize your key areas of applied science and consulting focus?
Okay, thank you. Just those few things. And so I suppose as I mentioned earlier, my story about making a difference with customers did go back to the aviation industry, where understanding what different people wanted from different parts of the experience was a fascinating observation, really, and beginning to understand that. And then, as I mentioned, going into retail, which is obviously at the very cutting edge of customer experience and customer centricity. I suppose one of the key moments that I remember was I was lucky enough to open a new branch with John Lewis, and at the time I was running the toys and Christmas stationery department, and we opened just before Christmas. And we put a lot of effort into opening this sparkly new branch, and spent a lot of time merchandising the shop floor. And I can remember being incredibly annoyed about an hour after the branch opened that was arrived and were messing up my beautifully merchandised shop floor. And of course, it was in that moment I realised that that's why we're here, isn't it? We're here for customers. So I suppose that was another moment of revelation about two things, which is never lose sight of why you're doing something, and normally that's for the benefit for the customer. And the other thing is that actually, without putting customers down, that they're usually not massively demanding about what they want from an organisation. There are normally a handful of things that are really important. And you've got up a slide which has a Simon Sinek quote, and this is where I think I'm trying to make a difference. So having spent time over the last 10, 15 years in what you might call the more traditional aspects of customer insight, what's really developed in my mind over the last 5 to 10 years is a different way to understand the customer. And I very much believe in this quote that you have on the screen, which is that customers ultimately, they don't buy what you do, they buy why you do it. It's a passion-driven connection. And actually, that's true whether it's a B2C relationship or a B2B relationship, because in a B2B relationship, the other B has a customer somewhere. And there's someone in that chain who's consuming something. It doesn't matter whether they're paying directly for it, but they're consuming, and that can even be applied to internal customers, if you like, in a chain of customers. The other thing that I think is quite unique is we use this word love a lot. So again, you'll hear organisations talk about they want to be, outstanding in the area of customer service or customer centricity. Actually, I believe if you believe in the why, then there's only one thing you want. You want your clients, your customers to love you. And I know a lot of people listening will have heard that phrase probably on occasions from their own clients. And when you step back a bit, it's really the only way you want a customer to summarize their relationship with you. And the reason we don't tend to use it a lot is because it has a soft connotation. We believe it's emotional. It doesn't appear to fit into business and have a direct on the bottom line. Well, of course, actually it does. If you love something or someone, then you'll give them a second chance, you'll spend more time with them, you'll invest time with them. So actually there couldn't be anything else that is more important than loving the relationship or the transaction you're in. And again, it doesn't matter whether that transaction is 15 seconds long or a lifetime of relationship, it's still incredibly important. So I think two things out of that. When I talk to CEOs in my own work, I really ask them is, what do you want a customer or a client to think about you? And we have a conversation about the only thing you really should want is love. And then we can talk very clearly about why that makes a huge difference to the bottom line, both in terms of profit, but also in terms of potential revenue. If we move on to the next slide. This is really, this is kind of an elevator pitch, which again is a different aspect of what we do. So I've talked about loving somebody for why they do something, but the other thing, and this comes directly from my experience at John Lewis, running the Insight department there, is most organisations are very, very focused on numbers. That's because numbers are relatively easy to create. They fit nicely into bonus schemes, they fit nicely into city figures, but actually if you step back, most of the time numbers on their own don't tell you an awful lot, and numbers in themselves can't tell you why they're changing. So if a number is going up and down, if your net promoter score or your CSAT score is going up or down, the number on its own, without quite a lot of experience, it's difficult to understand what lies behind that. As opposed to words, when you listen to a customer, actually words are very easy to understand and they're very meaningful. The challenge, of course, is that organisations will say, well, that's very hard because lots of people talking, lots of customers talking. How do we know which ones are right? Let me give you a little insight, which I always put to boards and CEOs when I start working with them. So going back to my Insight days, so if you have 1,000 customers talking about the same subject, to get a 95% significant confidence level, then you have to have 287 customers saying the same thing. And then you can be sure that that's true, and that's what stats tells us. But actually, when you say to a CEO, well, what happens if it's 250, or what happens if it's 200, or what happens if it's 100? You're just going to ignore them. Suddenly, human nature comes into play, and they start to say, well, no, I want to hear from those people too. And one of the challenges with conventional insight departments is if you have a really great analyst, then they will understand that. If you have an analyst who's not quite as good, you may not even know about the 200 or the 150 customers out of 1,000 talking about something that could be vitally important to your business. And the other thing, as I mentioned earlier, we have a very simple test which you can all apply. So if you think about any relationship you've had with any organisation, whether you've been paying for something or just consuming a service recently, if I ask you, what are the top 5 things that you need from that service, then you'll probably tell me the first 2 or 3 quite quickly, because they'll be at front of mind. You'll probably think about it a bit and tell me the 4th, and then you probably will make up the 5th because I've asked you for 5 things. And that leads me into another, I think, unique aspect of our approach, which is while we understand the need for surveys, one has to be very careful about them, because surveys will talk about what's important to the organisation. They will ask questions about what's important to the organisation. Actually, customers are normally very good and will go ahead and answer those questions because you've asked them. But it's quite possible to create a survey that asks a lot of questions about a subject and actually completely misses what's really important or what is needed by the customer because you didn't ask the question in the right way. So we very much prefer an approach where needs of customers and elements of customer experience and customer centricity emerge from a set of words rather than from a directive set of questions.
Great. I can relate very well to what you're saying. I mean, I gave you the example yesterday, Stephen, about the meeting that I had with one of my clients, where I didn't use a lot of numbers to make the case. It was a lot of words that resonated well with them. But most interestingly was going back to the other aspect that you talked about, love. What the customer sees in the way you do your work and what you like in the work most. Now, at the end of that presentation that we had with our client, they said, they both stood up and said, "We absolutely love you guys." And I was like, okay, so what else is new? And then the reason for that, and the motivation for them saying that was also articulated back to us, saying that we love you guys for being so passionate about the way you're getting involved in something that is our problem. So the next thing we know is they've been asking us to come in and put in a formal proposal. So I think there's a lot of sense and a lot of meaning to the 2 things that you're talking about, love and using this numbers to word journey to help clients. So customer centricity, there's no question about it. That's extremely important, and it's a relevant topic for all of our ICG clients. But here's the thing. This topic has also been researched quite well and has been discussed in many formats and in many forums. But you do bring a fresh angle and you bring a fresh set of tools to this particular topic. When we spoke yesterday, Stephen, we talked about things like active listening, getting the basics right, the use of grounded in saturation theory and things like that, which are all part of the tool set and which you plan to bring to a platform. So I found that your application of that insightful approach and the use of tools absolutely fascinating. And I'm quite sure that our webinar audience would also love to learn a little bit more about it from you and understand how you have been able to use that to make a significant impact on business.
Yeah, sure. I'd be very happy to talk through that now. So what we've talked about so far really is a mindset, is getting people into the right way of thinking about this new approach to understanding their clients or their customers, or their customers' customers. So what you obviously need is something which is very tangible. And again, some of the philosophy that I'm very keen on is that we actually develop an approach which is very pragmatic. And is clear and is concise, and clients can understand very quickly. I think I heard you, David, a few webinars ago talk about the need to be perhaps less consultancy in our language and more straightforward, and I think that's particularly true in this space. So we've developed a couple of principles, frameworks, templates, which help that thinking process, both at a strategy level and also at a tactical level. And I'll give you some examples as we go through. So the first slide you're seeing is a very simple diagram. It begins to get a CEO or a board level to think about what they're doing now. So we have a very simple triangle here. It basically says, look, in any business, there are a set of basics that you actually need to deliver all the while to a really good standard. And the problem with basics in an organization is that if you do them really well, no one will pat you on the back because they're just what you expect. You won't see them showing up in feedback. You won't see a positive score around them. They're just there. They're just what people expect. As we're innovation, which is the next layer up, obviously those are things that people will notice. They'll notice that something new has arrived, something's made it easier for them. Some new development, same-day delivery. We have Argos here in the UK where they're doing same-day delivery. You can order as late as 4 o'clock in the afternoon and still have it delivered the same day. Customers are seeing that as a real innovation and something that they're talking about. I know that because we do work for them and I see the feedback. So that's important. And then at the top of the triangle, we have recovery. So actually, recovery is where most of the love happens. So things always go wrong, not all the while, but occasionally. And how you respond to going wrong are the things that make a difference. Now, in a business, the only way you can level those things out is to have a view about where you need to put resource. And the percentages you see on this triangle are very high-level, generic view about this is how you should be focusing on your engagements with the customer. What we tend to find in lots of organisations is this triangle is upside down. So organisations are forced to spend a lot of time on recovery because their basics are broken or not delivered very well, so that's very expensive. And if they don't over excel in that area, it doesn't create love either. And the other thing that happens is that they get confused around innovation. So e-commerce, the internet, the things we can do are absolutely wonderful and absolutely necessary. But if you put too much effort into those things and you ignore the basics, quite simply the customer will not be around to see that new wonderful thing you've created. So the first discussion really with an organisation is, where are you on this scale? Where are you on this map? How are you currently deploying your resources? And then we really move on to, if we go to the next slide, onto a framework approach, which allows organisations to be very pragmatic around understanding the customer and then taking action on what the customer is saying. So this is a solution framework we use with a lot of our clients, and it's very straightforward. At the bottom, you can see there's listen, understand, and action. So there are 3 simple steps. On the left-hand side, there in the pink on my screen, there might be mauve on yours, there are a series of boxes which summarize the way that you can listen to customers. I'll just walk you through those. So most organizations will be already listening in the form of surveys. They're normally asking customers to score the performance, but remember what I said earlier, they're asking them to score the performance aspects that the organization is interested in, not necessarily what the customer wants to talk about. But they do also collect verbatim data usually, so they'll have a bit of feedback written. But when you talk to the client, they'll say, well, we don't really look at it because it's very difficult, we have a lot of it, and we don't really know how to collate it or bring it together. Or if they do look at it, they look at it from a tactical point of view, not from a strategic point of view. So we have a tool that allows us to bring that data into a database, and we can then categorize that data in a pretty fast way, partly with automated rules, partly with good old brain power, into a set of themes and issues that are relevant to what the customer is saying. And we let those things emerge. We don't direct them or preset questions into that process. And I'll talk a bit in a minute about how we make sure that's valid. We also realise that lots of organisations are now obviously talked about by their clients or their customers online. So we work with a partner who's produced a tool called Social Signals, which allows the collection of unstructured verbatim data from things like Facebook, Twitter, TripAdvisor, Trustpilot, pretty well anything that is public. So we can gather that information. That's quite interesting as well because it's public information, and therefore you can gather information about competitors or what other people are doing in your sector. You don't actually need that many permissions to do that. Again, we put that into our tool, into our database, and structure the data. We've also been working with another partner based in New Zealand, and they were originally branded Big Ears, and they've just rebranded to be called Customer Radio. We think this is a very exciting product. So this is a mechanism which allows customers to actually provide verbal feedback. So you actually get to hear the voice of what the customer is saying. You get to hear the passion in the voice. But the really interesting thing is, and where the radio bit comes in, is that, again, using our techniques, they can be streamed into themes and issue blocks. They can be curated, and then they can be played back via mobile or web devices to anybody in the business. So if you're the chief exec and you're driving into work, you can listen to the top 50 comments from actual customers about what they think about your service or what they think about your investment profile. And that's incredibly powerful because it's real customers talking directly into the ear of the CEO. The system also allows us to understand exactly who's listened to it in the business, how much they listen to, and spot trends and all that sort of stuff. And then the final, again, we bring that into the database. There's a text version of it as well as the audio version. And the final piece is good old-fashioned voice workshops. Some people call these voice of the customer, which is what they are. The unique difference that we have is rather than have a question profile, again, we have a format which allows customer needs to emerge during the workshop and to identify it from that way. Again, they're back into the database. When all of those things are done, we then go into what we call the understand mode, the big blob in the middle. And this is where some of the theories that Gopal was talking about come in. So we use, to let things emerge, we use grounded theory, which I'm sure some of you will have come across. Essentially, it just means that, things will emerge from the information that you have rather than trying to pre-fit them to an existing profile. But more importantly, we use something called saturation theory. It's kind of the alternative to the stats theory I was talking about earlier. And it has some maths behind it, but essentially what it says is when you stop hearing something new from a set of data, then you've reached saturation. So actually what we've discovered with this approach is that quite quickly, much quicker than people expect, significant core issues and needs emerge from the data very quickly. So actually you can listen to a relatively small set of, or read a relatively small set of feedback and get to the nub of what the issue is very, very quickly. And then of course you're able to take those things, put them into themes, put them into issues, and really we're moving into more traditional consulting techniques on the right-hand side where we're saying, okay, well, those issues are probably caused by one of these enablers: strategy, people, process, metrics, information, technology. And what we're hearing from the customer, of course, is the symptom. So what we need to do is a piece of pretty standard root cause analysis and work out, why that's happening. I'll give you a very simple example of that for something we've done recently. So we've done some work from a major supermarket in the UK. It is owned by an American supermarket group. One area of concern was automated checkout, self-checkout. They had roughly a third of their customers who loved it and shopped there because they could manage their own checkout process. They had a third of customers who wouldn't touch it with a barge pole because they hated it, and they had a third of customers who weren't sure. And when we listened to that set of customers, what emerged very clearly was, well, a whole set of themes around, I'm nervous about it, I don't really understand it, I don't understand what went wrong, don't understand why I have to have some intervention, I haven't used it enough to get confident with it because the first time I used it, it didn't really work properly, I was confused, I was embarrassed, I felt people were looking at me because I was causing a queue. So that's what customers were saying. If we go through that solution process, what we said to that group was, so tell us about the objectives of your self-checkout software design. and those objectives were all about fraud reduction. So the software was tuned to spot any fraud attempts or people not putting through the register. And what we said, well, look, how about this? How about for the first 3 months you put this into a new store, you dial down the fraud parameters so that people get used to it. They don't get as many interventions. They feel confident with it. They learn how to use the system because they're using it time and time again. And then over a period of time, you can dial up those fraud parameters once people have got used to the process. I was with that supermarket about 2 months ago, and they gleefully told me that that approach had now been adopted by their American owner and was being rolled out across the States. And it was at that point I thought, I wish I'd charged by the register. But there you go. So it is about taking that understanding, listen to the symptoms, putting it into issues, and then much more traditional consulting techniques where we can actually make a difference across a whole set of enablers on the right-hand side.
Yeah, if I might just jump in here for a second. You talk about customer solutions and the more consulting-like approach on the right-hand side. But I would add to that, actually. I mean, when I think about the discussion I'm having with my banking client, all that you've said with regards to listening and understanding fits so perfectly well with what they're looking for. But as an outcome from that, they're looking not only for consulting-like solutions for their customers, but also the ability to create solutions which are more specific to finance, whether it is banking products or insurance products and so on. So I think there's more to the right-hand side than just the consulting part.
No, I agree, and I think also that's where you also start to see innovation, because if you think about the fact that the customer has provided you with a symptom, you can obviously fix what's there already, which we would classify as basics, but you can then start to be innovative and say, what if there was a different way? What could we do with this? And I read recently, of course, Amazon are launching their Amazon Go product, which is completely cashless checkout within supermarkets. First one launching in the States, I think, early next year, where you rather like Apple, you just go in and you have an Amazon app, and the technology knows when you're taking something off the shelf, and you literally just walk out. So that's a great example of taking a set of feedback and then turning that into something innovative, I think.
Good.
Okay, if we go on to the next slide, I can just talk us through very quickly, some of which I've already mentioned, but we do have available, which we're using here in the UK, but could easily be deployed, I think, globally. This set of tools I've talked about. So in the top left-hand corner, you're seeing an example of the screens that come with the social signals tool. This is branded for Byron, which is a restaurant group here in the UK who we've done some work with. So that's gathering social media feedback. There's the customer radio tool at the bottom, where you're able to capture live voice feedback and curate that into radio channels. One of the big aspects that we're hearing from clients about that is, so traditionally textual feedback, even numbers, somebody has to sit down and read a report. As where this, you literally pop in a pair of earphones, play it on the bus, play it in the car, play it working to work. So the impact and reach across organisations, the practical delivery of what customers are saying is far greater and far easier. So the effort to deploy that in terms of what people are hearing and then what they're doing about it is much more pragmatic. And in fact, one of the biggest clients for that in the UK is Cabot, which is a financial organisation looking at debt management, which again has recently won some awards using it. The thing in the middle is it's an old version of the mobile app for customer radio. There's a new one which looks a bit slicker coming out, so this allows you to select playlists or radio stations and listen to what customers are saying. And then we've got, as I've said, a template and a set of procedures really for running our version of voice workshops. So this stuff has templates around it, has process around it that could be deployed and pretty quickly understood and learned by other people. And then this slide really is a sort of collection of the stuff. The top left-hand one is a simple view of one of our internal databases, which allows us to capture and qualify information, some of which is done by rules. And then it's a case of playing back. So some of these are example slides from customer presentations which begin to tell stories and give information. So the top right hand side is actually a health slide from the NHS here in the UK, and you can see that it uses a storytelling technique which is templated to allow people to understand, what's going on, what could happen. We use marginal gains cases by looking at what would happen if you fix some of these symptoms. We use set of rules around value add, which are very simple. They're actually adapted from the Wharton Business School in the States, which allows organisations to quickly get their head around what adds value to a customer and what doesn't add value. So a set of techniques and templates that can be deployed by any consultant really once they've been accredited.
Great. The picture that you have or the graphic that you have on the top right-hand side, which says how to use customer stories to create a business case. It's so ironic. The customer with whom we are interacting right now, they're talking exactly the same language. They're saying how to use elevated customer stories to create a business case. So what I'm going to do, Stephen, is I'm going to take this very slide and use it in our presentation.
Sure. Okay, that would be great. I'd be happy for anyone to do that and make things available. We have a great example where we were able to project and then prove through some monitoring that a very simple project taking account of what customers were saying increased their revenue by over £10 million. That's revenue, not profit. Revenue by over £10 million in the 8-week lead up to Christmas 3 years ago. Which they've now deployed as an ongoing strategy. So again, it's very pragmatic and can be demonstrated as being true.
Yeah. What I like most about your framework is that it's unique in the sense that it so specifically focuses on active listening across a broad set of customer channels, so that you can create a very focused plan and action for your customer. You did talk about one of your projects in the retail space, but could you just sort of walk us through some of the other assignments that you've been doing for your clients? And if you have any specific inputs with regards to financial institutions and any other retail customers, that I think would be very, very interesting for ICG.
Sure. If we go on to the next slide, so this is just an example of some of the clients we've worked with over the last few years. So we are still working with Argos in two ways. We're creating a new contact bringing these concepts together for them in their particular situation, so they can listen to and do active listening with customers. That's being presented to the board later this week. The Asda is the supermarket I talked about. They're quite an interesting one in that we did a project for the ops board there. They came to us and said that we've got a number of issues with our customers. We think one of the biggest issues we think is cluttered aisles. We think that we're really bad at having trolleys, cages on the shop floor to fill the customer shelves, and customers are really wound up about that, and it's a real problem. So it's a good example of when we help them do the analysis through listening. What actually happened was they were right. So cluttered aisles was there as a customer issue, but it was number 15. So there were 14 other things that customers cared more about that they had no idea about. So again, it's a good example of the difference between internal focus and external focus. A recent piece of work was for Firstport, which you'll see on the left there. They're the largest property management company in the UK. So they manage lots of flats and houses and so forth. So they're interesting because they're a B2B really, because their real clients are the building development companies, the people that build these developments. And the problem they were having was that those building companies were stopping signing contracts with Firstport because they were saying, look, we've got a real problem. When we go to sell our properties to the person buying the property, they say, who's going to be the property management company? And we say Firstport, and they say, oh, I've looked them up on the web, and they're awful. I'll go buy a property somewhere else. So it was actually affecting, so the consumer voice, if you like, was affecting their ability to sell to a B2B client. They did a piece of research themselves. They got back, there were a number of messages. They got back a message, one of which was, you're too expensive, your contracts are too expensive. They were looking at ways of cutting internal costs, reducing staffing levels, cutting back on all sorts of other things. Just before they did that, the board said, would you take a look at this different approach just to make sure we're doing the right thing? And we looked at that and we listened to their customers. What, of course, we had something slightly different. It wasn't you're too expensive. It's not cost, it's value. And what customers were saying is, look, actually, per se, your prices are fine, but you're not delivering what you say you're going to. You don't engage with us. We don't see you. You don't cut the grass when you're supposed to. You don't paint the hallway when you're supposed to. And of course, if we think about that, their proposed action around costs would have impacted that even worse. So they would have created an even worse impression with their customers. They listened to that. They reversed it this year. They've just won a customer service award from their customers, and the chief exec is up for a WOW Customer Leadership Award in March next year in the UK. So again, active, careful listening with allowing issues to emerge rather than to try and pre-fit them made a huge difference to that organisation.
Great. Thanks, Stephen. Recently we onboarded two other global thought leaders, one Professor Michael Grossman from Brisbane and another Ken Tenser from Canada. I asked them
Yes.
what attracted and motivated them to join our Global Thought Leader program. And their answers were, one, working with an intellectual peer group, and two, their belief and support for platformization of their IP. So now I put the same question to you. What attracted and motivated you to join ICG program?
Well, yeah, sure. I mean, having been somebody who spent only 10 years in consulting, I met David Maloney, and what David was saying about the future of the consulting model really struck a chord with me, because I agree. I think it has to change. I think it's outdated. I was very impressed by David's ideas. So that was attractive in itself. I'm also a great believer in that what I'm doing has to be productized, has to be created via a platform. So this seemed to be an ideal opportunity to explore that and find out how we could do that. And I do really believe that this approach, there is no reason why it can't be global. I think it needs local knowledge to make it work really well, but the concepts and the ideas, I think, could be deployed pretty well anywhere. So again, ICG seemed to be a perfect platform for that. And everybody I've met in London, I've just been so impressed with. So yeah, I'm with a group of friends really who we can work on developing this stuff together.
Great. Well, when we started off the webinar, we talked about the 3 best-selling books that you have written. The ones that you can see now on the screen: Customer-Centric You, People Centricity, and Customers on the Agenda. It would be great if you can take us through the essence of those books. We have another 10 minutes or so before we can wind up, but if you can give us a quick look into that. But what more specifically we would love to hear from you is, how are these books different from other books on the same topic, and whether they can be used as playbooks for us in either business development or in the delivery of our assignments?
Yeah, sure. So I suppose the first thing I should say is that there is a 4th book in production, which brings some of the ideas I've spoken about today into sharper focus. But if I go through the books that are there, so they're in slightly wrong order, in that the Customer-Centric You was the very first book that I was lucky enough to have published. So that's really a book about mindset and culture. So it talks about a simple way, a different way of approaching thinking about the customer. It tries to encapsulate 20, 30 years of experience from my point of view, and it's very much a mindset, which I think is really important, because if you don't have that mindset, then some of the practical ideas and concepts that we obviously people just can't get their heads around. So that book is normally the first book that people buy. The second book was Customers Are the Agenda. So that was a more pragmatic approach. It's about 2 years old now. It brought out a lot of the fundamental thinking about what we've been talking about today. That book has been very successful. We've had 2 clients who have bought large quantities, including Argos, the UK retailer. So they actually give that to their middle management as part of a foundation course that they run internally around how to think about customer. So that's been wonderful that they decided to do that. And then the final book, People Centricity, is a slightly different take. It reflects on the fact that to have a great customer engagement or experience, or to be customer centric, a lot of that comes down to the people that you work with, and that doesn't really matter whether those people are on the front line dealing on a daily face-to-face basis, or whether they're the people designing your website or your products. But so much of that is about how you treat people, and again, it kind of builds on the experience I had in the John Lewis partnership, where that business, which was set up 120 years ago by the founder, he very clearly said, look, this business exists for the benefit of the people who work in it, and actually if we focus on them, then that goodness and that vision will sort of bleed out into the way we deal with customers. And that's really what people centricity is about. It's about understanding the people that work with you, in relationships, etc., and how you can understand a bit about their agendas and how you might be able to mutually add to that, and therefore that generates, again, the right mindset to allow that to bleed out into the customers you're dealing with. What is that Argos has is that as a retailer, they employ a whole host of different people. They quite a lot of younger people, perhaps at university. They employ them 20 hours a week. Argos is just a fraction of the time that they spend in their lives, and it has that relative importance. So this book is about how you understand who those people are and how you can get them to their best in that business environment and in a personal environment for the time they're spending talking to customers.
Great. So now it seems like we've got all the ingredients in place: original ideas, 3 fantastic books, and a 4th one on the way. And plus you have some really fantastic framework and tools and so on. So the question now is, how do you plan to productize your IP for use by ICG and its client?
Yeah, sure. Well, I think this is something I'd really like to focus on going forward. So we have productized the approach here in the UK. We are dealing with a set of associate consultants here who are getting to understand how to use those products, how to bring them together, how to sell them to the client, how to demonstrate value, how to create change within a client using them. So now, I'm interested in taking those concepts and applying them across the ICG platform, which I think is entirely possible. We're working very closely with the London hub here in the UK to do that. So that's going to be a major focus for me going forward. The other thing, because obviously things keep changing. So there was a piece of theory we didn't mention earlier, which is called Kano theory. Some of you may have heard of it, produced by Professor Kano in Japan in the 1980s and 90s, I think. It's quite complicated. Again, there's lots of stuff in it, but essentially, when you read through it all, it boils down to a simple thing, which is what is new and sparkly today is part of a basic tomorrow. So I mentioned earlier Argos's same-day delivery service. Everybody in the UK thinks it's marvellous today. I can see in a very short period of time that's the standard. So there are 2 questions there. How long does it take for something in a particular sector to become a basic? So it's important for organisations to understand that. So I'm doing some research around that. But going back to the whole voice thing. So again, there was an article here a few weeks ago that surveys are dead. I'm not sure that's absolutely true yet, but I think voice is going to be a massive thing moving forward. And if you move on to the last slide, of course, what we've seen introduced in the last few months is things like Amazon's Smart Hub in the home, so that little black cylinder on the table there, where you can talk to it and ask about weather and get it to play music. Wouldn't it be great if you could just say, I'd like to give some feedback on this particular organisation? It listened, it collated it, and it sent it off. And the same with Siri on Apple. So I think there's an opportunity brewing where we can use voice technology, which is easy. So again, I mentioned the fact that it was easy for an organisation to consume that voice technology. I think if we make it easy for a customer to give that genuine voice feedback, then that's another big frontier and step change in the way that people listen to, actively listen and understand what customers need from them and begin to understand how they can innovate.
Great. So as we come closer towards the end of our program, how do you think ICG consultants can get involved in your work, and where do you suggest they start?
So I'm very keen, from my experience with the London Hub, to work with ICG consultants wherever they are, really. I think we have some collateral, we have some information. I'd be very keen to accredit a number of consultants around the world. I think that's, for the first handful, that will be an experiment, and we'll work out how we do that, given the distances involved, but I'm keen to do that. So again, very keen to work with any ICG consultant who thinks, a bit like you, Gopal, who thinks, actually, this is just what my client might need, and I will support them in, going forward with that, putting the proposition, looking at the process and the practice that they need to actually deliver that successfully into their client.
Great. I think, like I mentioned yesterday to you, Stephen, I think the most immediate opportunity that I personally can see from the Stockholm Hub is the banking opportunity that we're pursuing, where the topic is so completely aligned with everything that you're saying. And I love your last slide, and that'll also be part of my presentation. And at some point in time, we will find a way to have you connect with our customer as well. Great. So everybody else has been quite patient so far. So I think it's time for me to open up the discussion for all the others, if anyone has any questions.
Gopal, it's David Maloney here. Good evening, Stephen. Thank you for an excellent presentation. It really reinforces for me why we created the Global Thought Leader Program in the first place. I think when I talk to clients about customer, they seem overly infatuated with NPS, and I just wondered, what is the segue either through or around NPS to raise the sort of customer listening toolkit that you've developed, which is in some way differentiated and additive to the NPS story that many of our clients have become so used to? Well, I suggest that we schedule a launch webinar, not for the Global Thought Leader Program and Stephen, but for Stephen to find consultants that would like to become accredited in his toolkit. Obviously, they can watch this webinar beforehand to become somewhat acquainted, and then perhaps Stephen can take a more detailed approach to some of the key tools. So I suggest you might coordinate with Stephen to find a time to do that relatively soon, because not only is he accrediting consultants in our London hub, but seems to be very eager to find customer-centric consultants from other hubs around the ICG universe. So I think in his absence, we should thank him for what's been a significant contribution to the Global Thought Leader Program. He's a great addition, and I really enjoyed and congratulate you on your Q&A style. I think it was a perfect balance between the two of you. So well done.
Yeah, Stephen is back online.
I'm back. Yes, I was muted there for some reason. I don't know why. Sorry, I can answer that question, David, about your NPS stuff if you'd like me to.
Perfect. That would be great. Thank you.
Okay, so we're not in any way suggesting that this approach is a complete replacement for CSAT or NPS. But a crucial factor of NPS is, is the textual feedback that so many organisations either corrupt, don't ask for, or if they do ask for it, don't really listen to it. And we had a classic example with a client the other day. He was showing us a line chart of NPS scores going up and down, and we said, "Is that happening?" And they looked and they wondered and they said, well, "We don't really know." And there's one other factor I didn't mention earlier on, which we think is quite important. So we've done work with British Airways over here and with a couple of other clients, which shows that we have something called a customer latency effect. So what we can see is that even clients giving a good NPS score or a good CSAT score, so these are people in the top level, top quartile. They often will then go on to say something negative in their verbatim voice feedback. Now I think that's really important. So what we've seen is up to 20% of those people are making a negative comment. Now, does that mean they're not going to come back next time? Probably not, because they love you, because of the score. Does that mean they're going to come back the time after? Maybe. Does it mean they'll keep coming back? Well, I think there's a question. And if you don't address whatever that negative comment or theme is, in the classic way that happens, if you then get innovation or, more importantly, disruption in the industry sector, those people, your best people, the people spending most money with you, could literally go overnight. And if I was a chief exec, I'd want to know what that risk was. And I think at the moment, because of the way NPS is collected and analysed, and CSAT, it just isn't coming out. And that's nothing to do with those techniques. It's to do with the way that people are applying them, I think.
I think that's an excellent hook, and one I'll be testing very soon. I might see if there are other questions, but otherwise I have another burning question I'd like to ask you.
Go ahead, Dave.
The problem I see with NPS is it's about the experience someone had yesterday, last week, last month. There's a lot of recency bias in the way in which you think about the experience you've enjoyed with a particular brand, and NPS scores obviously reflect that recency bias. What I'm more concerned about, if I think about customer conduct, is what is the outcome we're actually helping to generate for the customer, and how is it that we as an organisation are starting to think about measuring and managing the outcomes we generate rather than the inputs or work in progress that we deliver for those clients. And I see that some industries have already started to embrace outcome measures, whether it might be school students' actual scores rather than the particular teaching methods that are employed, or the experience that the students think they've had with or their teacher or their school. Similarly with health professionals and health agencies, they're starting to worry about longevity impact, as a more accurate measure of the outcome that the business is trying to generate for the customer. So I just wonder what your reflections are on this sort of wholesale shift to not thinking about it from a purely sort of shareholder, what have we flogged to the customer, but what is the customer doing with our products to create an outcome that's meaningful for them, and then because of that, more ultimately meaningful for us.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. So, even going back when I was running a research and insight unit 15 years ago, we were acutely aware that what we were seeing was a version of the past. It's a bit like looking up at the stars at night, isn't it, and seeing something that existed many years ago. And that's very true of a lot of scoring techniques. I think that it's a historical store, and therefore the holy grail is to predict what might happen next. And I think the subject of outcome measurement, which in itself is a major topic, and how you define it, is very important going forward. I think the danger for some clients is that they will just create outcome measurements as another version of their historical measurements, as where the techniques we apply, I think, because they're more holistic and because customers are choosing to talk about subjects that they want to talk about in their words, and they are typically more holistic about the way they describe the business. I think that's a good starting base for a proper definition of ongoing outcome statements. A very simple example of that, and it is simple, is the fact that we challenge boards to talk about the scoring they have around the delivery of what they define to be their basic elements, and not in a way that we should go, well, that's great, but in a way that we're saying, well, it's kind of binary. It's either good enough or it isn't. And if it is good enough, then what are the next set of outcomes that you need to define? I think these things are all possible. You can gain great intuition in what those outcomes should be described as going forward from listening to the customer. What you shouldn't do is just take an old-fashioned score, put a label of outcome on the top of it, and say, "There, we've done it," which I've seen a few firms do.
Great, thank you, very helpful.
So, if there are no other questions, I'd like to thank you, Stephen, and everyone else for having taken the time to participate in the webinar. And we all look forward to the next GTL webinar. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks very much.